Hello and welcome back to baking. Today we'll continue discussing the challenges from the Great British Bake Off, and we'll focus on the technical challenge from Season 1, Episode 1. Let's chat about the classic Victoria sponge, also known as Victoria sandwich. I'm going to try out the same recipe that the contestants on the show were challenged with, and it's straight from the amazing Mary Berry herself. This iconic cake is all about three key components: a sponge cake, jam, cream, and icing sugar. Let's dive into the sponge. Like I said before, this recipe is pretty simple. It's kind of like making a pound cake. We're going to use all our ingredients in equal amounts. So we start with 225 grams of self-rising cake flour. It's really important to use cake flour here because I've tried this recipe with all-purpose flour as well, and I ended up needing to add extra liquid because the batter was way too dry. The thing is, usually all-purpose flour has more protein and can soak up more water than cake flour. Don't worry if you can't find self-rising flour. Just add 3 extra teaspoons of baking powder to this amount of flour. Next step, grab 225 grams of unsalted butter. It is important to have it at room temperature, so if it's a bit cold, just chop it into small pieces and let it sit on your kitchen counter for about 30 minutes. Then we'll need 4 eggs, also at room temperature, 225 grams of sugar, and 1 teaspoon of baking powder. This is our little insurance policy to make sure that our cake rises beautifully. Now let's make the batter. It's a bit of an unusual mixing method where we drop everything into the bowl and mix for a relatively short time. The challenge is to avoid undermixing because that means you won't have enough air in the batter. But at the same time, you can't overmix it either because that will develop a lot of gluten, making the cake tough and chewy. First, I dropped the butter into the bowl to slightly break it down and soften it, and then I added the rest of the ingredients and started mixing everything. I mixed it all for about 1 to 1.5 minutes. As you can see, once it's ready, the batter falls from the paddle in big and soft lumps. It's time to bake the layers. First, I preheated my oven to 350F or 180C. Next, I grabbed the baking tray and a silicone mat. As you probably noticed, I always turn the tray upside down because in my experience, it just makes it so much easier to remove the cakes from the tray after baking. For the cake layers, I used my 8-inch or 20 centimeters cake rings. Don't worry if you don't have this, regular cake pans work just fine here. Just make sure that you line the bottom with some parchment paper. Now, it's important to bake these cakes as 2 separate layers because the cake is a bit on the heavy side and it might not rise properly if you try to bake it all in one go. I also brought my kitchen scale to measure out equal amounts of batter for each layer, and then I smoothed out the tops with an offset spatula for that perfect finish. And that's it. The cakes are all set to go to the oven. While the cakes were in the oven, I made the jam. The original recipe called for raspberry jam, but guess what? Apparently I did not have any raspberries in the freezer, so I had to improvise with frozen strawberries. Now, when I looked for jam sugar at my local store, there was none there, so it seems like it just wasn't the season for jam making. So I just mixed regular sugar with some yellow pectin that I had, and that's basically what jam sugar is. It's a blend of sugar and pectin. Now, I took 200 grams of strawberries, 250 grams of sugar, and about 2 teaspoons of pectin. It's crucial to blend the pectin with the sugar before adding it to the fruit, because if you don't, you'll end up with a lumpy jam that is just impossible to smooth out. Also, you need to add the pectin sugar mix only when the fruit is around 35C or about 100F. If you add pectin to a mixture that's too cold or too hot, it won't gel the jam properly. Once everything is mixed, slowly bring the jam to a boil over low heat until the sugar dissolves. Then, crank up the heat and let it boil for about 4 minutes. After that, take it off the heat and carefully pour it into a shallow container. Let it cool down and set a little bit. 25 minutes later and our cakes are ready. They've got this lovely golden brown color, they look fantastic, and they spring right back if you give the tops a little press. Now, if you notice your cakes have domed a bit too much, it's a sign that your oven was a bit too hot. So for next time, set it to 325 F. As you can see here, mine are perfectly flat at 350, so I'm good here. I don't grease the sides of the pans, so I just run an offset spatula around the edges to gently release the sponges. Once I've got the layers out of the pans, I turn them onto a cooling rack to cool them down properly. Alright, now moving on to the buttercream. So in the bowl over there, I've got 100 grams of unsalted butter at room temperature. Next, I've measured out 200 grams of icing sugar, and then I'm also measuring 2 tablespoons of milk. The process here is super simple. We're basically just whipping together the butter and icing sugar. Keep an eye when you start whipping because icing sugar has this habit of going everywhere. To avoid that, try to gently mix it with the butter first before going in full speed with a mixer. Now, since this buttercream can be a bit on a stiff side, the recipe has milk to make it softer and easier to spread. Just add the milk bit by bit until you get the consistency that you are looking for. And remember, you might not need to use all of it. Now, let's jump into assembling the cake. It's pretty straightforward. We have 2 layers of sponge and we're going to sandwich them with buttercream and jam. I used a piping bag for convenience to pipe the buttercream, but you can totally use a spatula or even a spoon. The main thing is to spread it more or less evenly without going over the edge. Now, I didn't wait long enough for my jam to set, so you'll see some constant jam dripping as we move forward with the assembling and tasting later. That's why I put it on the top of the buttercream in a pre-made space with walls, but that's okay. I wanted to recreate the same conditions as the bakers had on the show where they did not have all day to wait for the jam to set. Another thing I thought about was that the jam sugar had higher pectin content and maybe I didn't add enough. However, the jam was set properly the next day. So I guess it was just a matter of time. We're finishing the cake with some icing sugar and now it's time to taste. Overall, the cake turned out pretty well, except for the dripping jam, which was totally my fault. The butter and soft texture of the sponge perfectly complemented the strawberry jam and buttercream, and I can see why Queen Victoria decided that it was the perfect accompaniment to her tea. It is a really simple recipe that can be done in no time, especially if you use store-bought high-quality jam. To create this recipe, I'd give it an 8 out of 10 for taste because personally, I would prefer to sandwich it with whipped cream and jam to achieve a lighter texture. But remember, this is a very subjective criterion based on my personal taste. I'd also give it a 10 out of 10 for ingredient accuracy and for the clarity of instructions. I didn't have any questions about the ingredients or about the directions given. It was clear and straightforward. So this is definitely something I'd recommend making and enjoying with a cup of tea. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching and I'll see you next time.